Good afternoon, everyone. This meeting is going to be our peacekeeping foreign policy discussion on the current groundbreaking situation between Ravinia and Tamania. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary, and representatives of the State Department, Central Intelligence Agency, and the Defense Department, thank you for being here for this important discussion. We appreciate your time. Mr. President, here's the briefing on the conflict and situation that we have at hand. The neighboring countries of Ravinia and Tamania have been fighting a long-running war over their shared border. The two countries have recently reached a UN-brokered ceasefire deal. Both countries are distrustful of each other, and so observers worry that the conflict can easily flare up again due to a misunderstanding. Furthermore, this war has created thousands of refugees. In particular, Tamania has been slow to offer protection or aid to refugees and displaced people within its borders. And isolated attacks against ethnic Ravinians who ended up on the Tamanian side of the ceasefire line have been reported as well. The UN Security Council is discussing sending a peacekeeping mission to Ravinia and Tamania as well. Both countries would need to consent to the mission, and they're open to the idea, but a little cautious about it. The question of the mission's mandate, what it's assigned to accomplish, and what powers and resources it's given is still up in the air. Our priority here today, gentlemen, is to come to a consensus on what to do with this situation. Here are our options. 1, support a UN-led peacekeeping mission with an expansive mandate, which would include monitoring and reporting, as well as protecting refugees and aid deliveries using armed troops. 2, support a limited UN peacekeeping mission focused on monitoring and reporting along across the border, consisting of a handful of lightly armed troops and a few surveillance drones. Or 3, oppose the peacekeeping mission totally, because the conflict is already so great and our intervention could possibly increase the risk of attack on civilians in Tamania and lead this to a greater conflict. The floor will now be opened up to our different departments to give their opening opinions on what the best move forward is to reduce the risk and threat of violence of conflict. The conversation will move forward in an orderly fashion, with members wanting to speak being called on by me by raising your hands. Each of you, when called, will have 3 to 4 minutes to present your findings and brief the president on what you think. So we will now move into round 1, our opening talk. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President and the National Security Advisor, for bringing this meeting to order. As the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, I would like to present to you, Mr. President, with pros and cons for why you may or may not want to support this mission. And I would also like to present to you overall recommendations for how we can specify the mission and make this bring realistic peace to the region. Finally, I would also like to present to you roles that I can provide as Director of the CIA that may help this situation. I'd like to first present my arguments why this may not be a valuable endeavor for the United States and why we may want to oppose this intervention. The first is that UN peacekeepers will likely be ineffective in protecting civilians because they are limited by strict rules of engagement. There's also language barriers because in this region, the UN peacekeepers from Asia or Europe or South America, wherever they may be, do not speak the same language as the people here. In 2014, the UN itself found that peacekeepers only respond to about 1 in 5 situations in which civilians are threatened. So famous examples would include the Rwandan genocide and Srebrenica, where UN peacekeeper inaction enabled the tragic loss of life among civilians. So that's a reason why civilian life may not be effectively protected by UN peacekeepers. There's also potential for negative externalities brought on by the UN peacekeepers. When they come in from other countries, they may accidentally bring disease, and they may be ill-trained and have not good ethical standards, and we've often seen sexual violations in the past brought on by UN peacekeepers. My second argument for why this may not be an opportune time to intervene and support the UN mission is that peacekeepers may not be able to protect themselves, and this puts a lot of danger obviously to the UN peacekeepers, but also from a PR standpoint, looks bad both to the United States, to the West, and to the entire United Nations. My third counter argument why you should oppose this mission is that historically the UN is more effective before war and not during the conflict. At this point, we are at the military stage of the conflict and the diplomatic stage is over, another reason why the UN might be ineffective in this scenario. My final argument for why you should oppose this is that consent from either country can be withdrawn at this time. The UN Security Council mandates that during peacekeeping missions, both countries involved must consent to the involvement of UN peacekeepers, and if they remove this consent at any time, the mission stops, the troops go back home, and honestly it will look like, to the public, a failure on our part, or at least, we will not be as effective as we could be. Those are the reasons why you may want to oppose this mission. I will now present to you reasons why this mission, is opportune and why this might be valuable to our national security interests both at home and abroad. The first pro that I'd like to present to you is that this option of the UN peacekeeping mission does not put any American boots on the ground. It does not threaten any American lives. The only things that we have at stake are our interests, which are small, and resources such as money, which we would fund the United Nations through. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, quote, the U.S. Government Accountability Office reported that financially supporting the UN peacekeeping missions would be 8 times more cost effective for the United States than if we were to directly send U.S. troops into a conflict zone, end quote. My second argument for why you may want to actually intervene here is that it is highly unlikely that either country wants to pursue a peace deal. They have a bitter border rivalry with humanitarian implications, and unfortunately, that being said, it is very unlikely that either side is going to come to the table and be willing to negotiate. I would now like to present to you some recommendations on overall themes such as the mandate or goal of the mission, how we can bring lasting peace, and some overall assumptions and things that you should know about the United States Security Council and some other aspects of our national interest that we can use to our advantage. As for the mandate or the goal of the mission, I would recommend that our goal be ceasefire, an end to violence and bloodshed, restoring the protection of humanitarian interests and civilians. We should not be involved in direct nation building, like upholding a government. We can use indirect means through the CIA, for example, to influence peace and to promote democracy, but we should not be involved as we were in Afghanistan or Iraq for a long term. As for troop presence, I would recommend a significant amount of troops on the ground in terms of UN peacekeepers, enough for strength in numbers so that they can protect themselves and be effective in protecting civilians and themselves. They're protecting the peace and protecting civilians is far more important than any budget, so I think we should be willing to ask the UN to increase their budget and have a significant protection force here in this region. The second recommendation I would give to you overall is that it is unrealistic to expect lasting peace. For this reason, I think we should aim to create conditions for peace, not just the absence of conflict. But I don't think that we should draw ourselves into a months-long or years-long intervention. Another thing you should know about the UN Security Council is that although we may support this mission, we have to be willing to accept the fact that the United Nations Security Council may veto it overall. For example, we need 9 out of 15 countries to support it, and if either the United Kingdom, China, Russia, or France, if any of those countries oppose it, the mission fails immediately, and we've kind of wasted our time. It's no reason to oppose the mission, though. We should be wary of it, but I think we can move forward and hope for the best with the United Nations Security Council. Another thing we should keep in mind is that we can use American assets as bargaining chips. We can use sanctions, for example. This is similar to during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the U.S. removes missiles from Turkey in order to resolve the situation. Another of our priorities should be humanitarian workers, whether they're American or from international. They should be involved in order to have a peaceful presence and promote the interests of civilians in peace. Finally, I would like to end with some roles that I can provide for you as director of the CIA. I can provide surveillance to monitor the situation on the border, as well as human rights. This will build trust and admiration amongst the local populace when they see that the United States and the CIA is acting in their best interests, not trying to flare up the conflict, but trying to protect civilians. The CIA can also send analysts to form connections with local leaders and to defend and support our allies, whether they be tribes or warlords across there, to promote our own interests. The CIA can also be helpful in terms of disarmament. This is literally the removal of weapons and landmines so that it creates a more peaceful region. And finally, the CIA overall is just going to be a disguised non-military intervention. And this means that we won't have U.S. troops on the ground, and both countries will be a lot more welcoming of our analysts than they will be of U.S. Marines and U.S. service members. That's all I have.
Thank you, CIA. We will now open the floor to our other two. Which one would like to go first? Okay, we'll hear from the State Department.
As the State Department, we would like to propose that this is a very important decision to affect re-election. The State Department would like to argue the situation of supporting a peacekeeping mission following key criteria. In this situation, we would like to argue that we would like a peacekeeping mission that avoids excessive loss of life for Americans. This means that supporting a peacekeeping operation, but also, if the situation turns bad in the two countries, the U.S. would pull out and would not entangle itself even more, avoiding past conflicts that have hurt reputation of said peacekeeping missions. The goal of this is first and foremost to ensure Americans stay alive. We do not want to put Americans in direct combat, but instead leaving them on the edges of civilian areas. This is a chance to offer them food and resources to crisis areas, but have no active Americans in the war-torn parts of the country. So really avoiding the border between the two nations. And if the peace is broken between these countries, the U.S. would, or the State Department would argue that the U.S. withdraws from the situation. We would argue that resources are key to this mission, so we really need the full support of the United States government to ensure that we don't have a commitment gap and ensure that our men on the ground have the resources they need. We would also like to have people there to help include women in the ceasefire and facilitate lower level situations to help gain civilian protection and focus on getting women included in these situations. This ensures a grassroots focus on top of a national commitment that is already occurring, but ensuring that this peace is more long lasting. The argument here that the State Department has found is that there really is a cause threshold. This situation, from what the National Security Advisor mentioned, is that Tomania has been slow to offer protection or aid to refugees and displaced persons within its borders, and isolated attacks against ethnic Rovanians who end up on the Tomanian side of the ceasefire line have been reported. This could really look like ethnic cleansing, and we do not want the U.S. to be on the opposite side of this situation, arguing that it does not. Now, there's also looking back to other issues in the past, Somalia and the Mogadishu effect. This really has just led to a hesitancy to engage in peacekeeping missions for humanitarian purposes. It has scaled back a lot of humanitarian efforts, and the State Department acknowledges that. But we're really looking out here for the refugees and the civilians. The problem that happened in Mogadishu was that the peacekeepers got too involved in the crisis and ended up taking sides more, and that was really what accelerated it than anything else. Really, and if we look at like Srebrenica, the lack of resources was really the problem there, and we really need to ensure that the resources are adequate in this situation. Basically, there's kind of, I'll wrap up with like the pros and cons of the situation. Pros, if this goes well, this is very good for our international image as a nation. We're really seen like as a nation that is helping people and really looking for other people. But at the same time, if it works out, there's not a negative domestic image, which is really key for re-election. As I said, I think this could be a very big part of the upcoming election. Cons, this would be expensive. And if the situation goes bad, if things do not happen like we foresee them happening, it would really hurt chances of re-election. Thank you.
Thank you, State Department. So, Mr. President, we've now heard from the CIA, we've heard from the State Department, and Defense Department, if you'd like to present your case now to the President.
Mr. President, members of the Council, as Secretary of Defense, I have serious concerns about supporting a UN-led peacekeeping mission in Rovanian Tomania. At this time, the ceasefire between the two nations is unstable and the security environment is unpredictable, and the risk to U.S. and allied personnel would be high. When we evaluate peacekeeping operations, we have to look at history, and as Secretary of State has mentioned, 1993 mission in Somalia, when U.S. Troops were in Somalia to help the crisis there, the humanitarian crisis that was going on, and stop the civil war. And we got really engaged with it, where we went to capture one of the main guys who was responsible, and then like that, it turned out to just be a big battle where we lost 18 U.S. troops, U.S. assets, and thousands of Somalis died. So we don't want to escalate, the conflict. The situation in Rovinia and Tamina carries some of those same warning signs: fractured local leadership, fragile ceasefire lines, and no guarantee that host nations can or will control local militias and rogue elements. An expansive UN peacekeeping mandate with armored units and armed troops and a massive logistics side of the military will be really expensive. And a clear command structure, it would require a clear command structure. Without that, we risk putting our people in harm's way with limited ability to respond effectively. If violence breaks out again, peacekeepers could easily become targets rather than the stabilizers. The Department of Defense cannot recommend supporting a mission where our troops may be deployed under restrictive rules of engagement and vague political goals or uncertain host nation consent. A limited monitoring mission, while safer, would not change the facts on the ground. If it would lack the authority or resources to stop ethnic attacks or enforce the ceasefire. In effect, it would serve more as a symbolic gesture than a deterrent. We would not commit even small number of U.S. forces to a mission that cannot realistically protect itself or achieve strategic results. That said, the Department of Defense does recognize the humanitarian crisis and the risk of a renewed conflict, and for that reason, we recommend an indirect support approach, using military assets to kind of do intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and humanitarian assistance if needed. We can also coordinate with our allies who are willing to contribute ground forces under UN command, but this approach allows the U.S. to remain engaged diplomatically and logistically without exposing American forces to unnecessary risk. In summary, the Department of Defense advises against a direct UN participation to a UN peacekeeping mission in Rovinia and Tamina at this time. The potential costs, both human and strategic, outweigh the likely benefits. Until the ceasefire is stable, command structures are clarified, and local consent is firm, the DoD recommends that the United States supports peace and aid efforts from a distance, not from the front line. Thank you, Mr. President and members of the Council.
All right, gentlemen, we will now be moving into our second round of our peacekeeping talk here, debate and deliberation. So this section is a chance for you to defend your recommendations, clarify your positions, identify potential areas of compromise agreement, but also challenge each other on what you guys think and what you said to form a really smooth and overall well-rounded argument for the president here. So we'll move in the same way we did with the last time. If you guys have something to say, please raise your hand and I will call on you and guide the conversation. So the floor is open now for debate and deliberation.
Thank you, Mr. President and the NSA. That was a productive introduction, and I think that we have some positive ground to work forward to. One thing I would push back against is the idea that UN peacekeepers would be effective on a humanitarian level. I think, unfortunately, we've seen, especially with the delivery of humanitarian supplies, medicine, food, and water, that often local landlords will seize these resources. So I think we have to be very intentional about how these resources are distributed. So I think it's up for debate whether we have U.S. assets on the ground in order to ensure that these goods and supplies are delivered, because they have to be in order to keep the local populace alive and well. But we have to balance that also with our own national interest, protecting our are Americans, and we also have to understand that unfortunately in situations like this, often the humanitarian situation is dire, so we can't expect total success when it comes to delivering resources to these people.
Do we have any challenges or objections or areas of potential compromise with that statement from the CIA? Yes.
Yeah, I kind of second that situation just because, like, while obviously there is no humanitarian aid without peacekeepers, having peacekeepers as the only form of humanitarian aid is not a guarantee that the situation will completely resolve, just because going to different countries, we really have to understand the different ethnic situation in the country and really the lower level situations going on that we might not fully understand. So it is definitely risky to deliver aid to these people.
I would also say that, I think like the Secretary of State mentioned, that, any red flags that we see, we should, be intentional about pulling out if we see the situation become more dire. I had mentioned that the UN peacekeepers aren't always effective during conflict, so if we see the situation start to go downhill, I think it would be very reasonable to advise the Security Council and our own assets to leave, just because we don't want to end up being caught in a longer-term conflict. Obviously, some of the historical examples show that this is very dangerous to our national interests and to our assets on the ground. So I think we should be very careful about monitoring the situation, and we don't have to be set in stone on how long our mission is there. If we see that the situation is unfolding in a way that threatens our interests, we should be willing and able to pull out as soon as we can to protect our men and women on the ground and protect the UN peacekeepers who are doing their job.
Will it not be too late to pull out if you already see that the situation has escalated?
It's a good question.
I would just like to reiterate how, in the Secretary of State's opinion, we should keep the peacekeepers away from the areas of conflict, which, while there are civilians obviously near the areas of conflict, we would like to protect the Americans that we have on the ground first and foremost. So if the situation gets worse in these areas of conflict, the peacekeepers should be far enough away that we can pull them out without any casualties.
I would like to agree with everything that's been said so far, and I would like to stress that, if we do see the situation deteriorating, that's no sign that, we should ride it out and wait until it betters. Often in these situations, once the humanitarian crisis collapses or once the military conflict boils over, it's not going to get better. So I would say, we shouldn't try to ride it out. In this sense, when you're saying, if we notice the situation deteriorating, is it already too late? No, I wouldn't say it's already too late, but I would say that's an opportune time for us to remove our assets and not overextend ourselves.
So do we feel like we've reached an area of consensus or agreement on how we should move forward?
Yes, I agree. I have a question for the CIA. Couldn't using the CIA in the same way kind of mirror the Afghanistan situation after 9/11, which famously did not occur very well? Would that not happen in the same situation?
I would argue that in Afghanistan, the CIA was more effective than the U.S. troop presence. This was obviously a very different situation, not necessarily, a conflict, but interstate conflict. This is, a very different situation. But I would say that overall, the CIA is often more effective because of its covert means in influencing the local populace. There's a great sentiment amongst people throughout the world that the U.S. flag on the shoulders of troops bodes poorly for that population. Whereas I think that the covert means of the CIA is often more effective. As it relates to Afghanistan, again, a different situation. But I think in that case, the CIA really, what we excel at is we very rarely overextend ourselves. It's a difficult position to be in the Department of Defense and dealing with some of those bloody, horrendous conflicts on the ground and doing the dirty work. The CIA often does a lot of work behind the scenes, in which case we avoid overextending ourselves. But in terms of U.S. troops, I don't think we should be worried about that at all. assuming that we all agree that, we should have a very limited, if we have any U.S. troops on the ground, we should protect them at all costs and probably avoid sending our troops, within reason.
Defense Department agrees with majority of what he said. Yeah, I don't think we should be sending our troops to into an environment where, right, there's gonna be groups of rogue kind of groups of whatever side just going around killing people, and we put U.S. troops in there. It's just gonna escalate. It's gonna flare it up. So I think we should not send U.S. troops. We should not send U.S. troops or UN peacekeepers into this conflict until it kind of mellows out. That's the Defense Department's view currently.
What would the mellowing out point be? What point
Just
would you consider it to be mellowed out enough to send in?
when everything seems to be, died down or kind of died down, where it's not, you can kind of sense where it's not going to flare up, right? Doesn't just where you can sense where everyone's kind of agreed not to continue fighting. But that's what I would mean by mellow out. But yeah.
I would also just like to emphasize that, we don't have any, significant national interests. Unlike Afghanistan, we had obviously, a horrific attack on our own soil. We had Al Qaeda and Taliban allies that we want to pursue and eliminate. That's not the case in this situation. We are more acting out of this, global self-interest or global interest for the common good, protecting civilians, and the humanitarian, situation, which is noble, but it is not, as paramount as our own, national security interests and counterterrorism goals.
For the CIA, what would you do? What would covert operations look like in this conflict and challenge Defense Department? Sorry. What would covert operations look like in this conflict?
Well, obviously, compared to these two countries, we have a technological advantage with our satellites and surveillance means, so we can incorporate, a reconnaissance role, as I had mentioned, to monitor the humanitarian situation as well as the border. This will help us inform our decisions about when the conflict is maybe, flaring up and boiling over, or maybe when it is kind of settling down and simmering. So I think that from a detached perspective, just our technological advantage will allow us to be better informed about the situation, and that can inform our decisions about how long and to what extent we are involved. I would also say that when we have men and women on the ground, they're not aligned with the U.S. military per se. Though I had mentioned that they often are more, the local populace is often more accepting of that than an entire battalion of U.S. Marine Corps members. As much as their presence is effective, with military troops on the ground, I would argue that having our men and women who literally dress as civilians, working with the local populace, our CIA analysts are incredibly well trained in the language, for example, whereas your average enlisted U.S. service member probably has no conception of the language here and the culture, whereas our men and women at the CIA have been training their whole lives specifically for this region and the language, so I think they can be effective in that way.
Would these operations happen near the conflict zones or more out, like in the countries, or just?
No, the typical battle is we have to discover and investigate where the conflict zones are in relation to the humanitarian crises, because if the conflict is right near the humanitarian crises, for example in a major city, that's where the CIA has a greater overextension, in which case we want to be careful. But we can often operate behind the scenes, behind the front lines, away from the battles, often where just because the conflict moves so rapidly, but the humanitarian crisis not so much. So hopefully the CIA can be more effective in a stationary role, and kind of establishing better long-term interests, not in the sense that we'd be there for months or years, but at least for days and weeks on end, promoting medical supplies and goodwill amongst the local populace. But we will obviously prioritize keeping our men and women safe. So if the battle comes to the areas that we're in, I would suggest that we remove our assets immediately.
Would you argue it would be beneficial for us as a country to send in troops when it comes to creating stronger bonds with different nations?
I would disagree with that. I mean, it would create having our troops work with other nations' troops would create a stronger bond. But I feel like if you have a massive force of UN peacekeepers, right, with U.S. troops and other nations, let's say the conflict flares up, right, pulling back troops could be, it could be hard, it could be challenging to get them out without, battles and whatnot. So, yeah.
I think if you're kind of asking, what the local influence would be of having, U.S. service members, I would say that although the local populace would be accepting and grateful for the presence of U.S. troops, I think that unfortunately, the U.S. troops can't always be perfect in terms of their execution of plans and battlefield tactics. So I think we would hate to see a situation in which the humanitarian crisis escalates because of the actions of U.S. service members, but that's certainly a possibility. When U.S. service members are acting in self-defense and trying to achieve objectives on the battlefield, that might be very near a major city where there's a humanitarian crisis already, in which case that could really reflect poorly on the U.S. military, which we want to avoid.
Are we at the threshold for intervening?
Like I mentioned previously, I would argue there is the situation at the border that could constitute a concern for ethnic cleansing in the region. Now, there is no direct statement of ethnic cleansing, so it is a decision that we still have to make in this situation. So right now, we are not completely at the cause threshold, but the decision to be at the cause threshold is very near, if that makes sense. Basically, it is still in the decision of our government to decide if we're at the situation where to call this an ethnic cleansing, but if we are there, it would be the cause threshold, and I would argue we are very close to that situation.
So, gentlemen, we're going to move on for the sake of time here to keep it going to round 3, our final positions, and ultimately our presidential decision. So, we're going to move forward from debate and deliberation. We all brought up very good points. And I would ask, as we move into this final position, to make it easier and more clear for President Mads, if we could all describe our unified position on where we stand right now and what our final decisions are. And then, Mr. President, as we move in here, you can state your 1 to 3 preferred positions of what everybody's talked about once they describe them and reiterate them to you. And we will finally reach a consensus here on what our final agreement and move forward is with this conflict. So if everybody would like to tell us where you're standing right now.
All right, I'll go first. So,
yes, Defense Department.
The Department of Defense opposes a UN peacekeeping mission. So if we commit troops, right, the conflict could rise up, and then we're pulled in the conflict, right, because, say 5 of our troops get massacred, right? We're then gonna be pulled in, and then we have families back home where we're maybe upset. There's a high risk to the U.S. troops, right? In Somalia, we lost 18 U.S. service members, and then thousands of Somalis died, right? In the fighting, there's gonna be unclear mission goals, right? You have an idea of, okay, we want to stop the ceasefire, we want to stop killings of civilians, but there's no real clear objective or exit plan, and operations could just drag on indefinitely, like in Afghanistan, for example. Weak host nation consent. So Ravinia and Taminia, we just commit ourselves to trying to stop the conflict from rising up again. They might see that as they might not like it, and so they might not fully cooperate with us, which limits our mission effectiveness. And then, rules of engagement are uncertain. Like I forget how you pronounce the one incident in, I think, Bosnia, where UN peacekeepers pretty much just witnessed the killing of people, and they couldn't engage. So, from the Department of Defense's perspective, we should oppose a UN peacekeeping mission.
State Department?
The State Department would like to completely argue that we should intervene and support a peacekeeping operation. Basically, the State Department would like to say that even though this situation could put Americans at risk, we would not like to diminish that fact. We also believe that this could impact our international reputation, and if the United States did not engage in this, it could decrease that. We are also saying that because there is an election coming up, we would like to argue that if we do not do anything, this could look poorly on the administration for the re-election. And the State Department would say that the situation will work if we include women in the ceasefire, really look at a grassroots focus and combine that with the national commitment. So not just sticking with the top, not just working from the top, but working from everywhere. And that is really only possible if we include peacekeepers in that process, just because they are on the ground.
CIA.
Well, Mr. President, I can tell that I'm somewhere in the middle between the state and defense departments. I would recommend, that we do intervene on some level, seeing as I believe that UN peacekeepers will have, will do more good than harm. So I think that we do need to intervene, but I think we should do it on a very limited scale. I don't think we should overextend U.S. assets at all. I had mentioned the various ways that the CIA can be helpful, but I do want you to understand that in all honesty, there are limitations to our effectiveness, especially in such a difficult terrain with a difficult populace and crisis to understand. So I think we should maintain, a strict and small mandate with regards to the UN Security Council and their mission. And I would like to emphasize that, you can always count on the Central Intelligence Agency to provide, covert assets and indirect means to influence the situation. But I would say overall that it is better to, execute, a well-planned mission today than it would be to have a perfectly planned mission execute too late. So overall, I would say that we should intervene on a limited scale.
So, Mr. President, as the National Security Advisor here, I'm just going to quickly summarize what they said, and then you can ask your final clarifying questions. On a time limit here, we have about 8 minutes left, and then we'll let you ask some clarifying questions, and ultimately weigh the final decision is going to be yours. So, to summarize, the Department of Defense says that we should oppose the peacekeeping mission because we'll have troops pulled in, unhappy families, it could cause greater conflict, and escalate into a deeper problem with the United States involved. Our State Department says that we should intervene and support a peacekeeping mission because your presidential election could be at stake, and not doing anything could hurt your chances of re-election with the election coming up next November. And we should also include women, not just go from the top down, but focus on grassroots organizations. From what we've seen, talked about clear historical examples. And finally, with the CIA, he was more neutral in the middle, but ultimately says that we should intervene, but on a limited basis, because peacekeeping and our UN peacekeepers will be able to go in there and help establish peace. So, Mr. President, the floor is now open to you to challenge, ask any more questions, clarifying that will help you come to a final decision. Sir?
State Department mentioned that it will hurt an re-election if we don't intervene. Do you think American citizens would like me to send troops into these countries and risk put American lives at stake?
I think there's obviously the argument that yes, it could negatively impact us when we look at like historical examples, like the negative impact Vietnam had on elections. But I would like to argue that in modern context, we see a lot of pushback against not intervening in crises like these. If it is truly an ethnic cleansing of some sort, it would be very bad for the United States to just completely ignore the crisis. So I would argue that yes, it is important for many Americans to be involved in this crisis as long as the United States protects its troops in the process.
And CIA mentioned that no American lives or troops will be in danger. How come when they are in a war-torn country that is unstable?
Obviously, our men and women at the agency understand the great risk and peril that they have in carrying out their interests. With that being said, these are incredibly highly skilled individuals who have spent their whole lives training, to prepare for situations like this. And I also think that we have to understand that, this situation is really two-sided. It's a conflict between two states. And that provides actually, some peace to me as a CIA director, in the sense that, we don't have countless factions who are kind of sparring over block-sensitive territories. That would be a more dangerous situation. with this because it's clearly aligned between two countries who are fighting over territory. I think we can more effectively protect our own assets.
Also, if UN peacekeepers are ineffective in protecting civilians, how are we supposed to protect them?
How are we supposed to protect the civilians or the UN peacekeepers?
The civilians.
Well, at a certain point, as much as we would like to protect the civilians, we would, I think all agree that, or I would actually argue that, we shouldn't overextend ourselves by sending in U.S. troops. But I think that we can use, the UN peacekeepers as a first option. If they are ineffective, I think then we reconsider, we reconvene, we have another meeting, and we say, should we send U.S. troops in? Would they be more effective? And then we reflect and we see, whether we pull out those peacekeepers or not. But again, I would like to emphasize that I think they can do more good than harm. There have been instances in the past when peacekeepers, have not been effective, but that's honestly, a policy, that's from a policy standpoint and flaws in the UN Security Council, not on an individual level with the peacekeepers themselves. I think they're, ethical, individuals who are volunteering and, working towards peace. And I think that we can allow them to do their work, and then we can, reassess at a later date.
Also, do we have any alternatives to the peacekeeping mission?
Well, I would say our alternatives are, somewhere, on one side we have a full involvement with the U.S. military, and somewhere on the other side we have, no intervention. But I would argue for maybe a middle ground solution.
And do all of you think that American taxpayers will approve this use of funds if we were to intervene?
I think if we intervene, wasting our taxpayer dollars would. I don't think our taxpayers would like it. It doesn't. There's no U.S. real interest in intervening. There's no real threat to our national security, and I mean protecting innocent people is a good thing, but there's no real threat to U.S. interests. And historically, I believe taxpayers have always been opposed to intervening when there's no threat to U.S. national security.
So, Mr. President, if you have no more questions, we will not move forward with the votes. The floor is yours to make a final decision, weighing all of these. Once again, the Department of Defense opposes the peacekeeping mission. The CIA says limited intervention, and the State Department says full-scale intervention.
So, after reviewing the recommendations from the CIA, State, and the Defense Department, I have reached a final decision. The United States will support a limited UN peacekeeping mission in the countries, but only under strict conditions that protect American lives and ensure the mission has a clear, achievable purpose. For example, the US will not deploy combat troops directly into the conflict zone. Instead, we will support the mission through intelligence, logistics, airlift, and humanitarian assistance. The UN mission must have a clear mandate focused on maintaining the ceasefire and protecting civilians and refugees, not long-term nation building here. This approach balances our moral obligations to prevent further civilian suffering with the need to avoid another open-ended military entanglement. It limits the US exposure while showing leadership in supporting multilateral peace and accountability through the UN framework.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. So we have reached a final decision. We will intervene with a limited nature. So to sort of combine what you guys all said, especially with the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. President, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Gentlemen, thank you. Mr. Secretary, CIA, Defense Department, State Department, thank you all very much. And we will now move forward with this conflict, hoping to bring peace to the region and send in some troops.
All right, thank you.
Okay.